The mountain bells of Santa Lloranza. High in the mist-veiled mountains of central Mexico stood the abandoned monastery of Santa Lloranza, a place long forgotten by maps and only rarely remembered by travelers who passed the winding road far below. The structure rose from the cliffs like a monument carved from shadow, its pale stone towers darkened by centuries of rain and silence. Cracked bell arches crowned its roofline, and narrow windows stared outward across the valleys like watchful eyes that had not closed in generations. The monastery had been built during the early colonial years, when missionaries believed the mountains were places of spiritual crossroads. Over time, the monks who had once lived there vanished from local records, leaving only scattered references to their quiet devotion and the great bronze bells they had hung in the tower. Those bells were said to ring even after the monastery had been abandoned. For most people in the nearby village of San Aurelio, the story remained nothing more than a caution repeated in low voices. Avoid the mountain road at night, and never follow the sound of the bells if they echo across the valley after midnight. Ignacio Cordero had heard those warnings long before he decided to climb the mountain. Unlike the villagers who repeated the tale with uneasy shrugs, Ignacio approached such legends with academic curiosity. He was an architectural historian specializing in colonial religious structures, and when he first discovered a brief mention of Santa Lloranza in an old cathedral archive, he felt the familiar thrill of encountering a forgotten place. The archive record had been brief but intriguing. It described the monastery as a rare fusion of European Gothic architecture and indigenous stone craftsmanship. Such buildings were uncommon, and Ignacio suspected that Santa Lloranza might contain carvings or structural features preserved nowhere else. Within a week, he had packed his equipment and begun the journey into the mountains. By the time Ignacio reached San Aurelio, the sun was already sinking behind the ridges, casting long shadows across the dusty plaza. The village itself was quiet, its adobe walls glowing softly in the fading light. A small church stood near the center of the square, its modest bell tower a pale echo of the grander structure Ignacio hoped to study above the valley. He secured a room in a simple inn where the owner, a thoughtful man named Mateo Villalba, listened patiently as Ignacio explained the purpose of his visit. "You plan to climb to Santa Lloranza?" Mateo asked. "Yes," Ignacio replied. "The structure could be historically significant." Mateo folded his hands in the wooden table and studied him carefully. "The monastery has been empty for many decades," he said slowly. "Yet people still hear the bells." Ignacio smiled politely. "Wind and shifting metal can create unusual sounds in old towers." Mateo did not argue, but the quiet expression in his eyes suggested he was unconvinced. "You may reach the monastery by following the old mule path at the edge of the valley," he said at last. but I would recommend visiting during daylight." Ignacio thanked him and promised he would begin the climb early the next morning. The following day dawned beneath a pale sky streaked with thin clouds. Ignacio packed his notebook, camera, and measuring tools before setting out along the narrow trail that wound upward through the hills. The landscape gradually changed as he climbed. Low shrubs gave way to tall agave plants and clusters of wind-shaped pines. The path twisted along steep slopes where the valley spread out below like a vast painted tapestry of green and gold. After several hours, the ruins of Santa Lloranza finally appeared above the tree line. The sight stopped Ignacio in his tracks. The monastery was larger than he had expected, its stone walls rising in angular layers that reflected the Gothic influence described in the archive record. Pointed arches framed the windows, and delicate stone tracery decorated portions of the facade, though many sections had crumbled with age. Most striking of all was the bell tower. It stood at the highest point of the structure, its open arches framing three enormous bronze bells that hung motionless in the mountain air. Ignacio approached slowly, his historian's instincts already cataloging the architectural details surrounding him. The courtyard inside the monastery walls had once been carefully arranged with stone pathways and a central fountain. Now weeds grew between the stones, and the fountain basin stood dry beneath a layer of fallen leaves. The main chapel door had collapsed inward, allowing Ignacio to step directly into the darkened interior. Dust floated in thin beams of light that entered through broken windows high above the nave. Rows of wooden pews remained in place, though their surfaces had been worn smooth by time and weather. Despite the long abandonment, the chapel retained a quiet sense of dignity. Ignacio spent the afternoon examining the walls and pillars, sketching the elaborate carvings that decorated certain sections of the stonework. The patterns blended Gothic motifs with indigenous symbols, spirals, flowers, and geometric forms that suggested the collaboration of different cultures centuries earlier. As evening approached, he climbed the narrow spiral staircase leading toward the bell tower. The steps were steep and uneven, worn down by countless footsteps from another era. When he finally reached the top, the mountain wind greeted him with a sudden rush of cool air. The bells hung above him in solemn silence. Ignacio moved closer to inspect them. Each bell was massive, its bronze surface engraved with intricate lettering that had grown faint over the years. One inscription bore the name of the monastery, along with a date from the early 17th century. He carefully photographed the details, fascinated by the craftsmanship. While he worked, the sky beyond the tower slowly darkened. Clouds drifted across the moon, casting shifting shadows over the valley far below. By the time Ignacio finished his notes, night had already settled over the mountains. He considered descending immediately, but curiosity encouraged him to remain a little longer. The legends surrounding the bells had intrigued him since the moment he first heard them, and he wondered whether the mountain wind might reveal the natural explanation behind the mysterious sounds. The tower was silent. Only the wind moved through the arches, whispering softly against the bronze surfaces. Then, just as Ignacio prepared to leave, the largest bell trembled. The movement was slight, barely noticeable, but it was enough to produce a low, resonant tone that rolled through the tower like distant thunder. Ignacio froze. He had not touched the bell. The wind had not strengthened. Yet the bronze surface continued to vibrate faintly. A second tone followed, deeper and more prolonged. The sound carried across the valley in a haunting echo that seemed to linger in the night air long after the vibration faded. Ignacio stepped closer, studying the bell carefully. There were no ropes attached to it. No visible mechanisms remained that might cause it to move. He placed his hand lightly against the bronze. The metal was cold, but beneath his palm he felt a faint tremor, as though the bell responded to something beyond the reach of ordinary sound. Suddenly another bell answered from beside it. This time the tone rose higher, creating a strange harmony with the first. The sound was not loud, yet it possessed an uncanny clarity that seemed to travel far beyond the mountain. Ignacio stepped back slowly. For the first time since arriving at Santa Lloranza, he felt the quiet unease that the villagers had tried to describe. The bells were ringing without wind, without touch, without explanation. As the tones faded into silence, Ignacio noticed something else. Footsteps echoed faintly from the staircase below. He turned toward the dark opening where the spiral steps descended into the monastery. The sound was deliberate, steady, and unmistakable. Someone was climbing the tower. Ignacio waited near the archway, expecting to see another traveler emerge. Instead, a solitary figure appeared in the shadows. The person wore a long, dark robe whose folds moved gently in the breeze that passed through the tower. The figure paused near the final step, illuminated faintly by moonlight spilling through the arches. Ignacio could not clearly see the face, but the presence carried an unusual stillness, as though the visitor had been standing there far longer than the climb required. "You hear them," the figure said quietly. The voice was calm, neither hostile nor welcoming. "The bells," Ignacio replied. "Yes." The robed figure stepped forward slightly, allowing the moonlight to reveal more of the garment's aged fabric and the faint outline of a hood. "They have rung for centuries," the voice continued, even after the monastery was forgotten. Ignacio struggled to maintain his composure. Who are you? A caretaker, the figure answered. The explanation seemed both simple and impossible. This place has been abandoned, Ignacio said. Abandoned by those who built it, the figure replied, but not by those who listen. The bells stirred again above them, producing another low resonance that drifted across the mountains. Ignacio realized then that the sounds did not resemble ordinary ringing. They were slower, more deliberate. Each tone emerged with the solemn rhythm of something remembering rather than announcing. The bells answer the mountain, the caretaker said softly. They remember every voice that once prayed beneath these stones. The words lingered in the cool air. Ignacio felt a strange mixture of awe and uncertainty. And you remain here to guard them? He asked. Yes. The caretaker turned slightly toward the valley. Someone must remain to hear what the bells recall. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved gently through the arches of the tower, carrying the faint scent of pine from the slopes below. Finally, Ignacio stepped back toward the staircase. I should return to the village, he said. The caretaker nodded once. The road will still be there. Ignacio descended the tower slowly, the echo of the bells following him through the silent corridors of Santa Lloranza. When he finally reached the mountain path and looked back toward the monastery, the bell tower stood outlined against the moonlit clouds. For a moment, everything was still. Then the bells rang again. Their distant tones rolled through the valley like a quiet memory that refused to fade. And high above the winding road, within the ancient tower of Santa Lloranza, the caretaker remained beside the bronze bells, listening patiently to the voices carried within their endless echoing song.